Morning, everybody. How is this fabulous hot July Saturday? Heard you guys talking about temperature. I think we're supposed to be 105 here today in Hemet. So we are all, thank goodness there's a little air conditioner in here. So we'll get started without any further ado. Welcome to the July Diamond Valley Writers Guild meeting. We have a fabulous speaker today. A couple of reminders. If the Zoom participants can mute their mics until they have questions. If you have questions, put it in the chat, raise your hand, wave at the camera. Lynette and Kevin Kindle, our vice president, I have to designate Kevin's today since our speaker's name is Kevin. We'll keep an eye out for people who have questions on Zoom. Anybody in the room, just wave at me and we'll get your questions answered. Anthology. Kevin, would you like to give a quick update on the anthology?
Sure. Submissions were, they finally ended at the end of June, and we ended up with 21 submissions from, I think it was 17 or 18 different members. So we're meeting here in, I think, about a week or so just to go through that, and then we'll start the process of editing and formatting and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, submissions actually went pretty well. There's a lot in the very last literally hours, so I stayed up till 1 o'clock in the morning my time just so I could cut everything off and do everything proper. So it was good.
Writers do need a deadline, don't we? Anthology website. Okay, website, Kevin, could you move on to that?
Okay, I haven't done much with the website. It's just been crazy busy up here, but we have updated the last two videos, or not the last two, it's the Allison Adams video and the Clay Stafford video are now linked into the member section. So that's about the only thing that's changed. And today we're going to have the poetry meeting going live for next month. So other than that, not much is happening on the website. If people are doing shout outs for books, by all means, let us know. So I'll get them on the member books section of the website.
Thank you, Kevin. He does an amazing job with our guild website. If you haven't checked it out, definitely go to dvwritersguild.org and take a look at peruse the member books, get involved in the forums if you wish to. And if nothing else, if you don't have a writer's website, you can use your profile as a paid member on our website in order to at least have a place for people to land when they're looking for you. So if you have any questions on that, reach out to Kevin, reach out to the guild, and we'll get you hooked up. So I have a side note for those of you in the room. If you probably notice over our door, we have a beautifully illustrated wall clock. And the reason is because our wall clock disappeared at the library. And one of the comments we do listen, by the way, to the survey remarks and comments. And one of the comments was, we missed the wall clock. We have no control over that. We are thinking about buying one just so we have one here for people. But Jessica, our treasurer, was kind enough to draw us one. I wish you on Zoom could see the illustration technique behind the 9:31 that's on our clock right now. I have a feeling that time is going to stand still during this presentation today. She said she's practiced since kindergarten for this moment, so she's very happy. And we're getting some silent applause in the room. Let's move on to shout outs and new releases, celebrations. Lynette, you want to talk about that? And then we will we'll move on to Kidlit.
Sounds good. As part of our membership benefits, we do a monthly shout out. If you have something exciting going on in your writer's world, maybe you did a book signing, maybe you got something going to just, did a blog, go ahead and send it to the guild. We publish it every, about the 28th of every month, and let everybody know. We have about, I believe, 400 people on our email list. So that's a great, inexpensive way to get the word out. We put your book cover on there if you gave it to me, and a little blurb and a purchase link. So take advantage of that for sure.
Thank you. Kidlit Critique Group and Accountability.
Okay. The Kidlit group is still meeting once a month. I wasn't here this month because my daughter got married, so I was on the road traveling. But another great benefit of being a member of the guild is you can bring your pages for critique and interact with other people who are actually writing Kidlit. So it gives you a community.
And again, all these benefits, if you're a paid member, it is only $25 a year to belong to this wonderful organization. If you are a college student, it's $15. If you're a high school student, we do have high school members as well. It's only $10. So there's a huge value to that, to our memberships. Call for volunteers, Jessica.
Starting to sound like a broken record, but that's all right. I don't mind. So if you want to help set up and make the hybrid meetings possible to be able to reach people across the country and across the world and connect with people from across the country and across the world, please come see me or Liam in the back to discuss talking about joining the hybrid team. You can learn how to operate, build the system, and perhaps one day sit back there and press the little glowy buttons and make all this switch around. So if you're interested, please let us know. You can either send it through the member form at the end of the meeting, the meeting response form, or you can email us directly at our email address, which is dvwritersguild@gmail.com, or you can come talk to us here in person. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I would actually like to give a round of applause, and you guys can applaud too, for our hybrid team. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. So I want to give them applause. Okay, one of my favorite parts of the meeting, member successes. This is the opportunity for our members to announce that they've had a recent publication, sort of like the shout outs and the celebrations. If they've gone to a writer's conference, maybe they started a new project, maybe they finished a project. So if you've had anything that you want to, it's your brag moment is what it is. So if you have anything that's happened since the last meeting or since the last time you attended a meeting, we'd love to hear about your successes. Anybody on Zoom? I know there's a couple people have to have done something in the last 30 days. Nobody? Okay. Anybody in the room have any successes? Please come to the mic. We have a first-time attendee, the one there in the center of the room. And introduce yourself, John. John's his first attendance of one of our meetings. He's getting his book. He has a lot of books in that backpack. Hold on. Okay, take it to the mic.
My name's John. I'm a new member. And the most recent, this came out on July 4th. I'm a military veteran, 32 years active duty. When I retired, I kept a journal when I went to Iraq. That's a 4-book series. But anyway, this is my most recent one. This is kind of a resume piece. It's an overview of the books I've written. And then I got a how-to series on how to start writing and get published, self-published. So anyway, thank you for your time and happy to be here.
Thank you, John. Anybody else on Zoom want to unmute and tell us about anything exciting they've had? Okay.
I will.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Karen.
I don't know if this is a huge success, but we just got back from Iceland, and I started writing a piece for Substack on what I learned about Iceland, and I realized that I used so many words writing about the experiences on the airplanes that I need to make it into 2 pieces. One about what I learned about airplane flights and what I learned about Iceland. So be looking for those on Substack. Thank you.
Excellent. And if you want to find Karen's Substack, you just have to go to dvwritersguild.org and put in the search bar for Karen, and everything she's done will pop up, including, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, a link for her Substack. Is that correct?
I really don't know. That would be wonderful, but I should check and see, right?
Yeah. Kevin, is that something that is linked to her profile, or she'd have to put that in herself?
She would have to put that in herself, and I honestly don't know if it's linked or not, but we can definitely check.
I'll check.
Okay, great. So Kevin and Karen communicate, and maybe you can link her so that she has visibility. That would be
Yeah.
fabulous. Any
And
other
Michelle?
celebrations?
I also, when I know you guys have done a blog post, I do put it on the shout outs. So I kind of watch Karen's Substack. And if I see it, I do put the link in the shout outs. There is a message here from Marco on Zoom. He said he attended the Writers Cantina in Utah last month. He learned quite a bit about writing, and he has lots of notes from panels he attended, and he got to meet Michelle in person.
Yes. Liam and I went to the Writers Cantina in Salt Lake a couple of weeks ago. I'm losing track of time. It was fabulous. Second year for that conference. They went from one day to a 2-day conference. They're growing. There were probably twice as many people, I would say, in attendance this year. And it was a really good conference, very intimate, lots of good information, lots of writers of we met people that literally had just started writing, had moved to Utah the day before, saw it on the internet and just showed up. And he was a young man just graduated from college, had never written anything, but he was ready to write. So it went all the way from there to New York Times bestsellers. It was a really good conference, and I'll probably go back again next year. It's 2 years in a row that I've gone to Utah for this conference. And we got to meet Marcos in person, which was exciting. Okay, I do have one quick announcement as well for me personally, and that is that I have a short story coming out, an anthology for Temecula Valley writers and illustrators. Supposed to come out, I think, September or October. I'm very excited. It's a 5,000-word magical realism story. And the neat thing is that the foreword for the anthology was written by Jonathan Mayberry. So I'm pretty excited about that. Good stories in there. It's a full color, full illustrated anthology. So every author was assigned an illustrator. I got this wonderful young lady who goes to art school in Pasadena. She did a fabulous job with the vision from my story, and I'm so excited to see that come out. Okay, well, we zoomed through, that was a pun, in case you missed that. We zoomed through the first part of our agenda this morning. They're shaking their heads in the back. And so we have arrived at the moment that I've been waiting for personally, and that is our guest speaker, and that's Kevin Ikenberry. So Kevin is a lifelong space geek and retired Army officer. As an adult, he managed the U.S. Space Camp program and served in space operations before the Space Force was a thing. He's an international best-selling science fiction author and renowned writing instructor, which is pretty cool because he never imagined being either of those. He still wants to be an astronaut, by the way. Kevin's debut novel, Sleeper Protocol, which, by the way, we own, I've got a copy of that, was hailed by Publishers Weekly as an emotionally powerful debut. His 25 science fiction novels include The Crossing, Vendetta, Protocol, Eminence Protocol, Runs in the Family, Peacemaker, Honor the Threat, Stand or Fall, Fields of Fire, and Harbinger. He is a core author of the mega-bestselling Four Horsemen Universe, with more than a dozen novels spawned by Peacemaker. Kevin is an active member of the International Association of Science Fiction and Fantasy Authors, International Thriller Writers, and Sigma, the science fiction think tank. Kevin continues to work with space every day and lives in Colorado with his family. And beyond that, I can say personally, he's a nice guy. So please welcome Kevin Ikenberry.
Thank you, everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. All right, so we're going to talk today about emotional resonance, and I've only got an hour, and so when we talk about emotional resonance, I'm going to keep things fairly narrow because I'm not going to talk about things like plot or theme or voice today. I'm going to give you some keys and some things that have really helped me over the course of my career really kind of get into emotional resonance. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. It's going to take me just a second here. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay. I think that's got it. Everybody can see the slide okay? Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm gonna walk you through emotional resonance to the point that you can do like I did and how to not make your dad speak to you for a week. So I'll tell you the stories as we get a little bit later on. So a little bit about myself. As Michelle said in my bio, I am a retired Army officer. I've done a lot of writing, but it was something I came to pretty late in life. So I didn't really start writing until I was 38 years old. This is back in 2009. I was on active duty with the Army. I was teaching ROTC at a small school in Indiana. And one Tuesday afternoon, about 4:30, I had this character start talking to me. And I was an English minor in college, and I'd been told in high school and again in college that I was developing into a good writer, but the idea of me actually writing a novel or writing fiction for publication never really crystallized until that moment. And so I took some notes about what I was thinking on with this character. And after about 2 pages of notes, I thought to myself, this is a book. How in the hell do I write a book? And so I went back, being on a college campus, I went back and took another creative writing class because I'd had one in college. And I turned in the first assignment, and the professor looked at me and said, Kevin, why aren't you published? And at that point, I just kind of started. So that first book that I started writing actually ended up becoming Runs in the Family, which was my second book released. But that book took me about 18 months to write. And when I got finished with it, it was a colossal mess, and I knew that. And so by the time it sold, the first editor I worked with said, this is a great book, but we're going to have to lose the first 3 chapters and a whole bunch of stuff in the middle because it doesn't work. So at that point, I started getting very involved and very interested in story structure and character growth. And I reached out to a couple of mentors at that point. And the difference with what happened with Sleeper Protocol becoming my debut novel was 18 months for the first novel. Sleeper Protocol I wrote in about 8 weeks. It was a tremendously successful novel. And that whole thing about being emotionally powerful, that's not by accident. So a lot of the things that I learned from my mentors are going to be things that I'm going to spend some time on today as far as some building blocks for you. We're going to talk a little bit about a kind of an emotional plan of attack that you can use for dealing with your characters and putting them in the right situations. We're going to talk about character growth in 5 critical questions. And then we're going to talk some tricks and tropes of the trade, if you will. I apologize. I'll probably ruin some of you for movies, because I like to talk a lot about movies as I teach, because while I could tell you everything that I did in Sleeper Protocol, it's much easier for me to highlight emotional resonance if I talk about things like Harry Potter, if I talk about Star Wars, the original movie from 1977. So there's a lot of things that we're going to talk about from a movie perspective. As one of my mentors once said, your book is a movie in somebody else's head. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to focus on your visual imagery, if you will. And then at the end, just because I am a story structure nerd, I'm going to talk you through something called archetypal story structure, where it's actually talking about character growth and development, but it actually lays out a story from start to finish, just dealing with the character and how they are developing through the course of the story. All right. So getting started, emotional resonance is all science. That's really all it is. If you have ever been a student of cinema, or you've been interested in watching movies from a critical perspective, this is something that you will often find called the mirror effect. And with the mirror effect, that means if I were the screenwriter for the project, I would be standing behind the screen and you, the audience, would be in the front. And I would be watching your reactions to my script, meaning that if I came to a funny part, I would want to see all of you laughing. I wouldn't want to see rolled eyes or, face palms, whatever else. I would like to see that emotional response from you. Same thing if I get to a point that is a sad moment, I want to see that sadness portrayed in your face. And that's very important to understand, because your readers are going to have the same reaction. I'd be willing to bet that most of you have been reading a book at some time, or even maybe working on your own stuff. And you've come across a moment where you laughed. It was funny. And so you had that emotional reaction. Same thing with, having a sad reaction. So it's not anything tricky. It's science. It's how we get involved with our characters, because really what it comes down to is we want to see ourselves in our characters. We want to see something of them. And as we talk about character growth and development, I'm going to talk a little bit about Luke Skywalker, because Luke Skywalker epitomizes a lot of things that all of us were at some point in time, which is a whiny teenager. So we can identify with those things as we go forward. So what we're going to talk about today is, again, how we can get to a point with emotional resonance where you can draw a reader in so much that they care so much about the characters that as things happen and you develop the conflicts in the plot of your story, you have pulled in your readership from an emotional standpoint, which is much easier to do than a plot standpoint. Okay, so when we describe our work, we always start with these words, right? It's a story about what? what do we typically say after it's a story about? It's typically our characters. This is a story about a college archaeology professor who goes on adventures and tries to find rare treasures. Indiana Jones, right? So it's a story about a young woman who is with her family, with the remnants of her family, is trying to survive in a post-apocalyptic future. And she calls herself to defend her sister and go on to participate in these games, right? The Hunger Games. So when we talk about anytime we're working with our stories and we tell it somebody else, we're always saying it's a story about our characters. We might get into the plot a little bit. We might talk about our big plot MacGuffin or whatever is driving some of the action, but we're really talking about our characters. And so I think from a writing perspective, especially as we're talking about emotional resonance, but something to put in your toolkit for later on is when we talk about writing, we really have to develop our characters first. And you may have the greatest plot idea. You may have a great theme. You may have the voice of the character as they start talking to you nailed down. You're going to have to flesh the character out more. And by fleshing out, I don't mean that you have to get one of those workbooks that you can find in Barnes & Noble that actually asks you like 500 questions about your character, like what kind of ice cream do they like? That doesn't matter. What matters are the things that we're going to talk about over the course of the next 30 minutes or so. Okay. So here's our plan of attack. So we're going to talk about writing emotionally resonant fiction, understanding 3 critical areas, which is character development, again, those tricks and tropes of the trade, and story structure as it relates to your characters. So we're going to spend a little bit of time in each of these. And as Michelle said, and what I communicated to the group before I started is, if you have questions, please feel free to stop me. I have no problem answering your questions and trying to keep things going, because I would rather you ask a question that you come to now versus coming to it later on or saying, I'll ask at the end, and none of us ever can remember our questions at the end, I promise. So if you have a question, please feel free as we go through.
Hey, Kevin,
yes.
Just so you know, you do have more than an hour. We got to you very quickly today.
Okay.
So you probably have closer to like an hour and 20 that we can burn through.
Okay. It probably won't take us that long, but that way, if we've got questions, we can go a little slow and make sure we answer everything. That's fine.
Okay, great. Anybody have any questions so far? You do on Zoom, unmute. Otherwise, we'll move on.
Okay, let's go on. Okay, so don't panic and have to write down all 5 of these questions very quickly. We're going to cover each one in depth. Okay, but there are 5 critical questions when we start talking about character development that we have to go through. Now, I just completely lost the word I was going to say. Giving credit where credit is due. Part of these come from a book on story structure and screenwriting that I highly recommend, which is My Story Can Beat Up Your Story by Jeffrey Allen Schechter. That's in my references slide at the end as well. But what Schechter talks about a lot is not working on movies from the standpoint of plot or theme. His is all about character development. And so when we start looking at different screenwriting books like Story by Robert McKee or Save the Cat by Blake Snyder, they vary off in different areas. I like Schechter's book because it really focuses on that character development piece, and I highly recommend it. So we're going to talk about who is your protagonist, what are they trying to do, who is with your protagonist on their journey, who is trying to stop them, and then what happens if they fail. As I said, we're going to break down each of these, and I can promise you that number 5 is the most detailed answer you have ever seen in your life. Just kidding, it's 2 words. All right, let's go to the first question. Who is your protagonist? Okay, we want our protagonist to be a sympathetic character, someone we can immediately have sympathy for, and we want to see them taken out of the situation that they're in and moved on to something different. Harry Potter is a great example of this. We'll talk about Harry Potter when we talk about tricks and tropes of the trade, because not only do we start Harry in a bad situation, but we do something later called kicking the dog, which really makes it the idea of seeing this character in this terrible position and just amplifying how bad it is so that we, the audience, are fully invested in getting him the heck out of his relative's house and on off to Hogwarts. Okay? Now, I have Wonder Woman up there as a sympathetic character, because when we first meet her in the very first movie, she is a very young girl, and she is trying very hard to prove to her parents, or prove to her mom, that she can do everything that the big kids do. Does that sound like any of you? Yeah, sounds like me. I know that I did it for sure. So we, again, identify with the character from that perspective because we've seen that. I talked about Luke Skywalker earlier. When we first meet Luke, he's a moisture farmer on the planet of Tatooine. And one of his first lines of dialogue is this whiny comment that he wants to take the power converters to Tashi Station. He sounds like a whiny teenager. I have a 16-year-old 2 rooms over that way who definitely qualifies for this. So we, again, understand where the characters are, and we see what they want to try to become. With Wonder Woman, Diana, she wants to become an Amazon warrior like her mother and all the people around her. Luke Skywalker wants to go to the Imperial Flight Academy, which we'll talk about later. So all of these things, we want to be able to identify with them immediately. One of the ways that we can do this is also having them suffer undeserved misfortune. So undeserved misfortune might sound something like this. Imagine you have a story about a Vietnam veteran who it's several years after the war, and he has decided that he wants to hitchhike across the United States and visit a lot of his teammates and try to catch up and heal themselves from the war. The problem is most of his team is dying from cancer from Agent Orange's exposure. And in one particular case, his closest friend, he's just learned that this has happened, and he's, again, hitchhiking, and he comes to a small town across a bridge, and he just wants to get over the bridge to this little diner and get a bite to eat. But he's stopped by the sheriff, and all hell breaks loose. That's the novel and the movie First Blood, which was the first John Rambo movie. And I would again say that I would obviously say that the book is better than the movie, but you get the idea. It's undeserved misfortune. Now, given that I'm going to step out on a limb here and say most of us in the Zoom and in the room that I can see probably remember some movies from the late 1970s, early 1980s with a character called Billy Jack. Billy Jack movies were always undeserved misfortune. You might have a storyline where Billy Jack just goes into town someplace and wants to buy a hot dog, and he gets in fight with a biker gang, and that takes off the rest of the movie. The Clint Eastwood movies of the 1970s and 80s, like Every Which Way is Loose and whatnot, all of those are the same thing. Something happens to the hero that is undeserved that they then have to react to. So on this slide, I have Deadpool. Deadpool kind of fits both of the undeserved misfortune and what we'll talk about with quirky and fun as well, because in Deadpool's case, he's not really a great guy when we meet him. He's kind of a mercenary, kind of does things for hire. And when he is faced with a dilemma after falling in love, he gets cancer, and he tries to go get treatment for that cancer and becomes disfigured. So part of his allure as a character is because he has suffered this undeserved misfortune, because we really think his relationship, when he falls in love, he's going to start anew. He's going to become a different person. And it does kick off his life in a very different way, but it's from an undeserved misfortune perspective. Now, quirky or fun, of course, Deadpool, obviously, he's called the mercenary with a mouth, or the merc with a mouth, because he is a smart ass, if you will. But we'll talk about something quirky or fun. Let me kind of change gears a little bit for you. How many of you have seen the movie? It's a comedy movie with Jim Carrey called Liar, Liar. So Jim Carrey in Liar, Liar plays Spencer, who is a lawyer who is suddenly compelled to always tell the truth. So if you think about it, how many of us probably can recite a lawyer joke right now? Lawyer as the butt of the joke is immediately quirky and fun. And we immediately sense we're going to have a good time with this character, because now we see this lawyer who is compelled to always tell the truth 100% of the time, much of the time to his detriment, which is hilarious. So when we start talking about the quirky and fun bit, all of those things come into play. So again, we want somebody that is sympathetic, someone that we, the audience, see immediately as we want them out of the situation that they're in. We can use undeserved misfortune to get them to that place, or put them in a place where the audience realizes very quickly what's going on. Movies do this very well, and we'll talk about some of those approaches and tricks and tropes of the trade later on. And then, of course, it's someone quirky or fun, if you can kind of make the butt of the joke about them, if you will. Now, the bottom line about your protagonist is simple. They are the center of the story. That means if you are writing a character that you have as your centerpiece, but you start gravitating your voice and you start gravitating your fun as a writer to another character, you're not writing the protagonist anymore. You have a problem. So you have to make the protagonist the center of the story. Now, if you start looking at movies and how things are done with interwoven story structures, like Star Wars, for example, we don't see Luke Skywalker first. So you don't necessarily have to start the story with the protagonist, but as the story develops, as you've introduced them, they have to become the center of the story and the linchpin, if you will, of what's happening in the universe around them. They also must stand out from other characters. So if you're familiar with some of the work, I know, Michelle, you guys have talked about Jonathan Mayberry. Jonathan Mayberry writes Joe Ledger. And Joe Ledger is a very standout character. He definitely, from a voice standpoint, Joe stands out. He's physically powerful, very military approach to things. He's seen it a lot. He's done a lot. So he stands out from other characters. Has anybody read any of Jim Butcher's Harry Dresden novels? Harry Dresden stands out from the rest of everybody else in the storyline because, again, he dresses differently on some occasions. He carries a walking stick on some occasions, and he's kind of like Deadpool. He's a smartass. He always has a smart remark for something. He's always quick on his feet, so he stands out. You can apply this across all genres. So if you think about thriller writers, like, we start looking at Jack Reacher, for example, or Alex Cross, the novels of James Patterson, it's the same thing. All of these characters are standing out from everybody else in the story, and they're still the center of all the action. Okay, so when we start looking at the protagonists from these perspectives, this should start helping you develop an idea of things that you need to do to actually have your audience connect with them. Because again, if you can establish these things very quickly, you have the audience essentially in the palm of your hand for the course of your story. All right? Are there any questions on question number 1? All right, awesome. Let's go to number 2. What are they trying to do? Okay, this is critically important. Your characters, all of them, must have goals. They must have some idea of what they want to do. If they don't have goals, storylines that can be of any magnitude that you want it to be are not going to work. Image Comics did a run in the 1990s of a storyline of a superhero who's like Superman level strength, but he's a bum and all he wants to do is sit around on his couch. It was called Major Bummer. The entire series, I don't know that it lasted a year, because why do I have this character if he can't go and do anything? If he doesn't want to have any motivations? So we all have things to do, right? Everybody set goals as you go along. I know I do. So those goals that we have for characters are critically important. Okay, so what they're trying to do has to be a compelling goal, right? Harry Potter wants to become a wizard. Once he's heard about his family's history, he wants to become a wizard. Luke Skywalker, on the other hand, has this goal where he wants to become a pilot. And of course, like I said, he wants to go to the Empire. He doesn't understand the inner workings and hidden mechanisms of the universe yet, but he has goals. So those goals obviously can change over time. Regardless of what you do, there are 3 types of goals. Now, you don't have to use all 3 types, but if you use all 3, you'll actually have a more defined character going forward. Let me explain the 3. So first off, you have your professional goal. This is the biggest overall goal in the story. This is the fight against good or evil, or the fight against the big thing that they have to do to destroy or they have to overcome. Think about this being something that you would likely read on the back cover of a novel. So if you were to pick up a book like The Crossing, one of my novels, you'd take a look at least the inner flap, and you would see immediately that we have this situation where I have a group of Army ROTC cadets from 2008 who have been sucked back through time. They've lost a modern rifle to the British Army, and that becomes their catalyst to report to General Washington and change the course of American history. That's the professional goal of the story. If you think about it from the Star Wars perspective, the professional goal in Star Wars is to destroy the Death Star. We, the audience, know about the Death Star before we see a single frame of film. Because if you remember, you see the Star Wars logo and the music comes up and we have the crawl, right? That text that we read that goes off into the distance. The Death Star is mentioned there. Now, I can tell you from experience, being 6 years old when that movie came out, reading the Death Star, wow, that sounds cool. We knew immediately what was going on. That was the professional goal. And if you go think about it, we don't see the Death Star involved until, I don't know, about 15, 20 minutes into the movie. We hear about it. We hear that they've got these plans for it, but we don't actually see it. So by knowing the goal ahead of time, either in like the back cover of your book or in the crawl, if you will, for a movie, or a flashback scene, something along those lines, we understand the professional goal very early. So the earlier we can get the professional goal out and into the audience's mindset, that the better off we're going to be. Now, the personal goal is a little bit different. The personal goal is a goal amongst friends, if you will. It's oftentimes what a person locks onto and then uses to pull other people into what's happening. For example, again, going back to Star Wars, Luke's personal goal develops because he sees the hologram of Princess Leia asking Obi-Wan Kenobi for help. And he, Luke, being the clueless teenager, says, she's in trouble, I have to rescue her. Okay? All of us at some point in our lives probably had some type of unrealistic goal like that too. But we understand that Luke believes that he can do something about this. And so that becomes his goal. He wants to find a way to help this woman in distress. If you think about later on, when they go to meet Han Solo and Chewbacca and hire them on as pilots, they don't really hear anything about Leia until Luke actually gets them on board the Death Star. And they're trapped in the little security shack, and Luke basically recruits Han and Chewbacca by saying, she's rich, which applies back to Han Solo's goals. So we'll talk about secondary characters' goals here in a second. But the idea is Luke is actually pulling other people into his caper, if you will, by the power of his personal goal. And then finally, you have a private goal, a goal that is usually spoken alone by your protagonist or from your protagonist to a mentor or some type of senior ally, if you will. It's something that happens in private, and it's deeply personal to the character. So Luke Skywalker again, Luke has this moment after he's gone home to find that his aunt and uncle have been killed by the Empire. He returns to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and it's just the two of them in the screen. The droids are off in the distance, and Luke quietly says to Obi-Wan, I want to become a Jedi like my father. Simple. Deeply personal, very private, shared only between one or two people, simply done. We'll talk about how Star Wars and a lot of other projects in just a few minutes actually flip that around, and the antagonist does the same things, which is deeply important as well. So the overall thing that you have to do with your characters is provide them goals because it provides them motivation. That motivation is going to lead to their character growth, and it's going to lead to conflict. Conflict is extremely important as we start looking at writing fiction. We could write any amount of story that we wanted to where things are always happening great and everything goes well, and your book is not going to have any action, and it's probably going to die by the end of Act 1. Nobody's going to care what's happening. So if we can create some motivation, we can provide some elements for growth, we're going to be able to see a character change over time. And changing a character over time is very important. That's why archetypal story structure that we're going to talk about shortly by the end is critically important to look at, because we as people, when we're seeing a movie or we're reading a book, we want to see growth and change. If we have a character that remains the same over and over and over again, we tend to get fed up with that character. Not to say that we don't have movies and characters that do those sorts of things. You could argue Jack Reacher does not really change a whole lot. I would argue that he does, but he doesn't seem to change that much over time. Anybody a James Bond fan? James Bond seemingly never changes. But if you look at the movies, you have the movies of Sean Connery, and then after the end of Sean Connery's movies, they hire in George Lazenby. And it was an Australian actor. And the movie that he's in, the only one, is called On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, James Bond falls in love and gets married. Doesn't sound like James Bond that we all know and love, right? Well, the backlash of that was so severe amongst the hardcore James Bond fans that we dropped back to Roger Moore, and all of Roger Moore's movies are about the same thing. They're about the same plot, they're about the same jokes, they're about the same technology, and honestly, it kind of got boring by the time you got into the mid-1980s. And so James Bond flipped the script. They brought in Timothy Dalton for 2 movies, which arguably one of them is way better than the other. And then went to the Pierce Brosnan, and then we went to the Daniel Craig phase. If you look at the Daniel Craig movies, Daniel Craig's storyline is deeply personal, and it is very powerful from a human perspective. So we've gone from the character who always does everything right and awesome to a character who is flawed and trying to overcome those flaws. That is the growth we want to do from the get-go. You don't have the time to go through, 10 or 12 James Bond movies to find your way here. You want to be able to start with goals and motivations that are going to cause that motivation that causes growth. Because again, growth is extremely important. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on number 2? I know that's an awful lot, but we're going to kind of bounce back and forth with this in just a couple minutes. So anybody have any questions?
Actually, Marcos had a question in the chat. Marcos, can you unmute and ask your question?
Sure, thanks. So my question was actually for the first point. You mentioned that the protagonist has to be quirky and fun, but do they always have to be quirky? Just because I've read a ton of stories across various mediums where the protagonist wasn't always quirky and fun. Sometimes they were more quiet and more reserved, but the story still worked, at least for me. So.
No, and Marco, that's a great question. And what I was trying to get across here is your protagonist. These are other ways that you can actually introduce your protagonist. You can have someone who is sympathetic. You can have someone who has suffered undeserved misfortune. You could have someone who's quirky or fun. You could do any number of those together or only one of those. It does not matter. These are just the tricks of the trade, if you will, for the protagonist. Those are 3 different ways that you could actually have your protagonist created around. The most important thing here that does apply to every protagonist, regardless of genre, are the last 2 bullet points on this slide. They are the center of the story, and they stand out from all the other characters around. Otherwise, those first 3, you can do what you choose. All right. All right, so we're through slide number 2, so let's go on to slide number 3. Oh, actually, sorry, let's go do Luke's multiple goals. Whoops. I usually have it where I have a display where I can see what's going on the next slide, and that's not working on my computer here. So, all right, so if I look at multiple goals, these are Luke Skywalker's goals from Star Wars. So we talked about destroy the Death Star. We talked about rescue Princess Leia. We talked about become a Jedi like his father. Pretty simple, right? Now, as writers, how many of us love writing log lines and story pitches and synopses? Yeah, I don't see that whole lot of hands up because I don't either. But if you look at it, by looking at Luke's goals, I basically have created the gist, if you will, of a synopsis. I can explain who Luke Skywalker is, but can he do these 3 things? I can put those together as one question. Will Luke Skywalker destroy the Death Star, rescue Princess Leia, and become a Jedi like his father? I've pretty much given you the entire storyline of the first movie just like that. Pretty simple. So multiple goals are extremely important. If you can make multiple goals happen with your characters, you will definitely start to have a connection with your audience, which is what we're talking about today. Okay, now let's talk about number 3. Okay, secondary characters can fill many different roles and archetypes. We could have another 3-hour class on different things that your characters could fill, right? You have characters that are the thinkers or the feelers. You have characters who are the deflectors, or you have, let's see, what's the opposite of the deflector? I just completely lost it. But you have these different roles that different characters will play over time. And all of them, regardless of what they do or what your purpose for having them in the story is, they have goals. Every character that has a goal. So if you take a look at my picture there, we've got Chewbacca, Leia, Luke Skywalker, Han Solo. So we've talked about Luke. Let's talk about Han Solo. What's Han Solo's goal? If you think about when we first learn about him, the first scene where he has with Greedo, where I believe Han shot first, but he is in debt to Jabba the Hutt. So we understand that whatever his goal is going to be motivated by money, which is why Luke then is able to essentially manipulate him later and say, she's rich, to get Han to buy into actually going on the rescue attempt to get her out of the detention center. So Han, that's really the only main goal we have for him, is he wants to get out of debt. You could say that he has a goal of protecting himself, but really that's Chewbacca's goal. Chewbacca is basically protecting Han the entire time. Over the course of all the different movies that Han Solo has been in, Chewbacca is essentially his protector and friend and co-pilot, whatever else, but that's what Chewbacca really does, is he protects Han. We think about Leia, though. Leia provides us an interesting dynamic. When we first meet Leia in the entire movie series, she is portrayed as a victim. She's very clearly portrayed as a damsel in distress, and George Lucas then piles that on. Not only is she captured by Darth Vader, who's this menacing goon, we'll talk about that in a minute, but then she's tortured. She's shown her planet, her home planet, being destroyed by this Death Star, and then ultimately she's scheduled for execution. So she is very clearly made the victim of this entire film. However, We also learn at the beginning that she's a senator. Okay, so she has some level of importance. She has some level of gravitas, if you will. So she has something that she does. And if you think about her and Luke Skywalker, she's portrayed very brave. She stands up to the stormtrooper. She's got her weapon and she tries to take them out. She's getting the plans to R2-D2 and getting them off the ship. She has this plan that she is working through and she's taking action. Luke, on the other hand, is a whiny farm boy who is doing everything his uncle tells him to do because his uncle needs him for the next harvest. So they have very different lives. But later on, after they rescue Leia, which the rescue attempt does not go well, Leia is the one that gets them out of the detention center. She blasts a grate and they jump down. Granted, they fall into the garbage pit, but Leia is the one that takes that action. So we see her then as this, again, formidable powerhouse, if you will. And she suddenly, when we get to the end of the movie, we see her standing in the command center where all the generals and the admirals and everyone are standing there of great importance. And we believe she has a seat at the table because we've seen her growth over time, because we knew her goal was to get the plans for the Death Star to the Rebel Alliance so they could destroy it. Pretty simple. Now, you don't have to break down each one of your secondary characters with 3 goals. Don't think that. You just have to have an idea of what's their motivation. Why are they in this story? Not just because you think it's cool to write them. What's their place? What role can they fill for you? And again, this is another one I would point you back to Jeff Schechter's book, My Story Can Be a Pure Story, because he actually talks about the unity of opposites, right? Where you have a thinker and a feeler, for example. The thinker is Leia. The feeler is Han Solo. Don't tell me the odds. That's his thing. He just kind of feels his way through situations. Leia is very tactical, very analytical. So all of the different characters in Star Wars, both on the good side and the bad side, fill this unity of opposites. And what it does is it gives you an opportunity to develop depth amongst your characters. Having your protagonist stand out is easy, but if I have all my secondary characters with all these multiple goals, I have trouble doing that. My protagonist has maybe 2 of the 3 or all 3 goals. My secondary characters really only have 1. That's an easy way for them to stand out, because now I understand what Han's motivation is versus Leia's motivation over this kid, Luke Skywalker, who I watched develop over the course of the movie from whiny farm boy to hero of the Rebel Alliance. The big thing you have to do with your side characters is treat them very carefully. I can tell you from experience that I have written a project where I've gotten really involved and I've written this great protagonist, but I have this secondary character who I've written who suddenly starts to maintain a lot of power. It starts to have other things and other motivations, and I start thinking of ways that I can add another goal to them and I can add more conflict and I can develop their story. If I go too far with that, I risk not having my protagonist be the center of the story. So you have to be very careful with this. How do you do better at it? Time and experience. That's really all there is to it. It's just an opportunity to look at your secondary characters with one simple goal or one motivation versus those of your protagonist and go from there.
Kevin, we have a question in the room.
Perfect.
Hey, I'm Andre. I just had a question. Because sometimes when I'm writing, I get my secondary characters. Sometimes they become a lot more interesting, and I kind of strayed away from my protagonist. Has this ever happened to you? And how do you make your protagonist more interesting than your secondary characters? Because sometimes I'm writing their POV and I'm sticking with that one, and I need to switch back to my main character and whatnot.
So Andre, like every book I write, man, there are some times where I develop something with a secondary character, and I start to see that growth. I start to see more things for them to be able to do. And I just have to rein myself back in. And, my story needs to be focused on my protagonist. I can add some spice and some elements with my secondary character, but as long as I do that in a way that it's going to have them reflecting and changing or motivating the main character in a different way, that's the key. So if I can focus them and what I'm seeing in them and their development back to the main character, it's a good way to go. Now, I'll also tell you there's a great comic series from the 90s called Astro City by Kurt Busiek. And one of the stories, I don't remember the characters off the top of my head, but you could clearly see that it was the hero and sidekick story, right? Batman and Robin, sort of a thing. And what Busiek did was he wrote the entire storyline from the POV of the sidekick. So it can be done, and there's other examples out there as well. So you can actually write the entire storyline from the sidekick's perspective. But if you're wanting to stick with your protagonist, have what your sidekick, your secondary character, your sidekick is doing, reflect and change and move your protagonist's growth forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. Have your secondary, because sometimes it's even like a subplot that wasn't supposed to go so far, but it was really interesting towards me, and like, wow, now I need to get back to my protagonist. So maybe some of those things that are organically come into life, I guess, for the secondary, maybe get more into that state for like your main character or protagonist, I guess.
Yeah,
apply those elements and whatnot.
Yeah, and if you're, I'm one of those people. I will tell you, I love to let characters run down rabbit holes. So if you let a character run down a rabbit hole, whatever they're developing, have that reflect the main storyline. Have that cause something to happen with the main character, some change, some realization, and everything will work out okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? All right. Let's go on to question number 4. The bad guy. Okay? Now, I will tell you first thing before I get into any of the bullet points on the slide. With as much time as you're putting into your development of your protagonist, the questions and their goals and everything else, you must do the same thing with your antagonist. If you fail to do so, your book will die in Act 2. And I can say this from personal experience. So when I was writing Sleeper Protocol started as around a 10,000, 15,000 word novelette, and then moved into a novella, got it to about 30,000 words. And I kept working through different ideas, and I had different antagonists. I had this whole character line where I had this assassin character, and none of it was working. And I finally came to a realization of who the antagonist needed to be. And I remember I had been through foot surgery, so I was on my way with a couple of friends from here in Colorado Springs up to Denver for a small comic convention. And I'm in the back seat, and we're talking, and it came to me as I'm crutching my way into the parking garage. I knew who the antagonist needed to be. And I said, hey, what did you guys think if I changed the antagonist to this? And they were both like, oh, wow. And the next weekend, I went home, rewrote my entire outline for Sleeper Protocol, and then, like I told you, 7 weeks to write. So when you develop an antagonist and you develop them organically alongside what you're doing with your protagonist, you have a great opportunity for conflict, and conflict drives emotionally resonant stories. So also important to recognize conflict doesn't necessarily have to be character versus character. It could be character versus nature, character versus God, character versus all types of things. But I have to have that conflict involved. So that means my bad guy needs to be both powerful and committed. So let's break this down. Powerful means they need to be in a position of power. Something about them is different. So I have Voldemort on here. Voldemort is a very powerful wizard. So he has this power, but he's also committed. He's driven to his own goals, and he will stop at nothing to reach those goals. So I must be in a position of power, must have the commitment to make his goals or his or her goals reality. Okay, this is a very simple concept that a lot of people miss. You have to put them in some type of position of power. Now, does that mean authority? No. Power and authority are two different things. So I can have a character who is powerful but does not have any authority over the rest of the characters that I may be dealing with. They just have this position, if you will, where they can change the protagonist's trajectory. So I'm going to skip number 2 for just a second. We'll come back to it. So the third bullet can be either the true antagonist or a representation of them. So going back to Voldemort, do we really see Voldemort in the first movie, the first book? No, he's mentioned, but it's not from a physical perspective in conflict with Harry and his friends, not so much. Who do we have, though? Snape. Snape is actually portrayed a lot as Harry's antagonist. And in reality, you would say, as you get through the course of the storyline, spoilers, he's really not that bad of a guy, but he's been placed in a position by Voldemort where he has to essentially act like the antagonist. So, true antagonist or representation thereof. Now, this is where I get to have fun with you. We've talked a lot about Star Wars. Who is the antagonist in Star Wars? How many of you say Darth Vader?
The Emperor.
Got a couple hands I can see. Yeah, the Emperor is actually the true antagonist, but in Star Wars, we don't meet the Emperor. So who is his representation if it's not Darth Vader? Nope. It's Grand Moff Tarkin. We'll talk about Grand Moff Tarkin in a minute as the antagonist. He is the representation of the Emperor in the first movie. What's cool about when we talk about Tarkin, I'll use him as my example for their goals in just a second. Tarkin and Luke Skywalker never meet. Tarkin never knows who Luke Skywalker is. He's never told about anything. So you have this antagonist who is doing all these things for the storyline with no knowledge of the protagonist. It's really pretty fantastic storytelling. So how do I have an antagonist then that places obstacles in the way of the protagonist? So going back to the second bullet point. So there's a big misconception that the protagonist is walking along this journey and the antagonist is saying, now you have to overcome this, and now you have to overcome this, and now you have to overcome this, and now you have to overcome this. It's not the way it necessarily has to happen. A lot of this you can do via world building. You can actually have your character beginning to learn that the world that they expected to find is very different. And so as they get into this world, you start introducing challenges to them that both help them lose their innocence and also change them over time. Have them making decisions that might work, might not work, but learn from them. Okay, this is a critical aspect of storytelling that we have to have our characters grow through learning. If you touch a hot stove, are you going to touch a hot stove again? No, at least I hope not. Excuse me. If we have characters that do the same things over and over again, and the audience is expecting them in this repeating pattern, how many of you have ever walked out of a movie theater or closed a book, maybe thrown it across the room, just left it? This is what happens. We want to see that aspect of ourselves, right? We want to see growth and learning and change. It is so powerful. It is so important. So when we do this via world building, you might have something like what happens to Luke Skywalker. So Luke Skywalker goes back to Obi-Wan Kenobi, says he wants to become a Jedi like his father. The first step is they go to the Mos Eisley spaceport, and they're immediately stopped by stormtroopers. Obi-Wan gets them out of it with the Jedi mind trick. These aren't the droids you're looking for. They go to a bar to look for a pilot. Luke bellies up to the bar thinking he's all that and almost immediately gets in a fight. Obi-Wan has to step in, save his life by cutting off a guy's arm. They go to the table with Han and Chewie. They sit down and Obi-Wan's trying to negotiate and Luke is almost about to screw that up because he's thinking, I got to play the tough guy. These guys don't know anything. Luke is an innocent. He has no clue what's going on in the universe because he wants to go to the Imperial Flight Academy. He thinks all of his friends have gone there. The Empire are the bad guys. So Luke is starting to learn with what's happening on Mos Eisley that the Empire is not all it's cracked up to be. And so all of his experiences in that whole section of the movie are all about him learning, hey, what I thought I wanted to do is not what I need to be doing. So we see an aspect of growth. We see an aspect of, if you will, internal conflict, because Luke is trying to be what he believes he should be, and what he thinks he is going to be is not what is needed for the story. And Luke has to change. If he remains a whiny farm boy at the entire end when he climbs into the X-Wing fighter to go destroy the Death Star, all of us have left the theater. We don't care. We don't want to see him succeed. We'd probably only stay there if we could see him get shot down or something, because we want a character who grows and changes. We want to see that if you will, that progression. Now, your antagonist has to be powerful and committed. They have to place those obstacles in front of the protagonist, and we do that by their goals. Okay, so again, we talked about the protagonist having goals. The antagonist has to have goals, and they must be diametrically opposed from one another, complete opposites. Let me show you what I mean. So we have Grand Moff Tarkin, played by Sir Peter Cushing. And if you look at his goals, and you think about what he actually says in dialogue through the movie, this is exactly it. He makes the comment in the staff meeting where we first meet him, okay, how many people would imagine seeing the antagonist for this movie introduced in the staff meeting? But you first see him, and one of the first things he says is, we are going to use this battle station to pacify the galaxy. Period. So he basically steps it out there. Hey, yes, there is this thing you guys learned about called the Death Star and the Crawl. This is what I'm going to do with it. It's this massive weapon system, and I'm going to start destroying planets, and I'm going to rule, or the Emperor is going to rule through fear, and I am the Emperor's hand, if you will. So he basically says we're going to do that. He tells Vader early on that we must destroy the rebellion. And when they're privately together in the same room, but everybody else is gone, Tarkin makes the comment to Vader, we will finally destroy all of the Jedi. So just like Luke Skywalker, he says it in private to Vader. This is one person, but his goals are actually diametrically opposed versus those of Luke Skywalker. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now, this is why it's important to have them in opposition to one another, because conflict makes a great story, and great stories are emotionally resonant. You can have a story with a protagonist who you've set up and you've developed, and if you give them an antagonist that does not meet their goal level, right, does not have the same amount of preparation, does not have the same amount of depth that you've put into it, you have a problem with your story. And like I said, it will die in Act 2. So you want to make sure that you do something different with that. So my novel, Runs in the Family, was the first novel I ever pitched to an editor. And it was great because the editor said, I want to see the whole thing. So I got this full manuscript submission. So I sent the manuscript in and I got it back rejected. And I ran into the editor at another conference later that year. And he looked at me and said, your book dies in Act 2. And I said, why? He said, because your antagonist doesn't do enough. You have this protagonist that you've got doing all these things, and you tell a great story with the protagonist, but I don't know enough about the bad guy, and you don't show me that the bad guy is powerful, and the bad guy, if they're not stopped, is going to have all these bad things happen in your universe. You've got to amplify what happens with the bad guy. So the minute I did that, I brought the bad guy, if you will, in power and strength to what I wanted the protagonist to do or what the protagonist needed to go through, the story worked. So goals are critically important for everything that we do with story. Okay. Anybody have any questions on goals?
If you have a question, go ahead and unmute. You're doing such a good job covering everything. No one has any questions. You're very clear.
Usually it's because everybody is mind blown at this point.
Oh, we do have a question in the room. Here we go.
Great.
Hey, so one more, I guess, at you. Do you ever have a protagonist where it's maybe throughout the series, or at least the beginning, the goals are not quite defined, or are those something? Is that something that you must define right away?
So anytime you find a storyline, particularly in fantasy, for example, where you have a character that goes on a quest, they pick up their goals as they go. Something spurs them to action. That's a whole story structure thing called the inciting incident. But something spurs them to action, and then as they go, whatever goals that they might have had will change, and they will morph into what you need to have happen from that story perspective. So yeah, you can totally have your characters find their way, but they usually start with some type of goal, and the more you can show them having to change from that and do something different, think about Frodo and Sam wanting a nice, quiet life, right? Nope. So if they wanted a nice, quiet life, and I send them on this inciting incident, they have to learn the importance of what's happening, and they start to see what their goals are and change over time. So yeah, you can totally have them find their way, but you got to give them a start point, and then you can kind of change it from there. Okay. Everybody ready for the biggest question? What happens if they fail? It's life or death. Okay. We talk about stakes, right? These are the highest stakes you can imagine. It's life or death. So you think about a storyline like the Hunger Games, we can kind of see that's life or death. Star Wars, to an example, is life or death. Indiana Jones, life or death. But we talked about Liar, Liar a minute ago, right? With Jim Carrey, it's a comedy movie. Nobody's going to die in that movie, right? Yeah, you're right. In this particular case, we talk about life or death. It does not have to be literal. Okay, with the case of Liar, Liar, the death here would be the loss of his relationship with his son. Okay, so he has to understand the stakes. If he can no longer, if he can be accountable and not lie and be the father that he needs to be, he will still have his relationship with his son. And he recognizes that if he can't do those things, he will not have his son. So it does not have to be a literal death. It can be essentially a figurative death, if you will. But you've got to raise your stakes up as high as humanly possible, because the greater the stakes are, again, the greater we become involved as readers and viewers of the storyline. We want to see that success. We're on the journey with the protagonist. We want to see them succeed. It's also pretty liberating to let them fail. Now, I could diverge here and go into a story structure lecture to you, but one of the things that I learned about story structure, especially for your second act, if you will, of a storyline, is your characters act, but you've got to have them fail. So you can't have them continually improve. They've got to see some setbacks. And if you show them some setbacks and you force them to reevaluate, you force them to grow and change, I will tell you from experience, it is very liberating as a writer to be able to get a little bit deeper into a character. Okay, so now that I put them up against this and they didn't really succeed, they had some losses, they learned some lessons, how would they change? What could make them different? And how would that difference affect what goes on later? So we talk about cause and effect, or we talk about try-fail cycles. We want to see those things happen because everybody, at least in my room here, I'm not perfect. I've screwed up a lot. I've touched the hot stove, if you will, and I've learned from those experiences. So there's certain things that I do and that I've never done or that I would never do again. So you want to make sure that understanding the stakes is very important. And at a certain point, your characters have to understand the stakes as well. And we'll talk about that with archetypal story structure here in a little bit. Okay. Any questions about life or death? Just make the stakes as high as you can for the story and make sure your characters know them and understand them, and it will work. Okay. We'll talk some tricks and tropes right now, and most of this is designed pretty short, and I'll use movies as an example here because it's a great way to see it, but I'll also give you some ideas from books as well. All right. Okay. Your protagonist. Trope number 1 is the orphan. I bet all of you in the room and all of you on Zoom within about 10 seconds could come up with 5 orphans from popular culture. I'll do it quickly for you. Katniss Everdeen is one because Hollywood's definition of an orphan is the loss of one parent. James Bond, who we've already talked about. Bruce Wayne. Superman. See where I'm going with this? And John Rambo, because John Rambo is a orphan by choice. He's decided he wants to be alone. So very quickly, you can probably come up with your own list. Think about characters like Annie, right? Heidi. They're all orphans. Is this trick overused? Absolutely. Okay? But it's also something that Hollywood does very well. Think about The Martian. Mark Watney is orphaned on the moon by a dust storm and then has to survive. So what am I doing here? I'm basically setting up that sympathetic character very quickly. Once you learn that a character has lost their parents, maybe it's something from the development of cinema forward and the development of storyline from Pulp Fiction time forward, we immediately have empathy for this person because they did not have parents or they did not have a proper upbringing, right? It's designed to make us immediately have that sympathy for the character. Harry Potter's another great example too, because we learn very quickly that Harry's orphaned and he's living with his relatives. We don't need to know much more to make him a sympathetic character. Okay? All right. Any questions on the protagonist being an orphan? He said this one's pretty simple. Okay? It's almost as simple as the chosen one. How many stories do we have with the chosen one? Holy cow, there's thousands of them. Okay? Not just Neo and the Matrix here, but thousands of stories with the chosen one, right? Most of the time, a character that is a chosen one is introduced as not knowing or not caring or being a huge skeptic like Neo, okay? In Neo's case, everybody, Morpheus and all the crew on board the ship are telling him he's the chosen one, and he doesn't believe it. And then they take him to see the Oracle, and the Oracle's like, you are not the chosen one. The Oracle's using a little bit of negative psychology later on because he really is the chosen one, but he needs to be the one to overcome the skepticism. He needs to be the one to believe in himself because he's a valuable commodity. And some cases, we might have that valuable commodity held back for their own safety or the world's own safety. Okay? So if you think about the Terminator series of movies, right? Especially with the first movie, the Terminator is sent back to kill Sarah Connor, who gave birth to John Connor, who was the hero of the rebellion. If you think about John Connor is also an orphan because his father is killed by the Terminator. This is crazy how all these things work. But that's how Hollywood in particular works your emotions from the get-go, so that you understand within the first couple minutes of a movie why a character is important and why they should be sympathetic and why you should be rooting for them. And you can do the same thing in fiction. It's pretty simple. All right? Kicking the dog. I talked about this earlier. So we talked about Harry Potter, right? Harry Potter is an orphan. Harry Potter is the subject of the book, so we understand he's also the chosen one, right? So how can I make this any more compelling? I'm going to take him and put him in a miserable situation. We're going to kick the dog. So not only is an orphan, not only do we understand he's the chosen one, he needs to go and do something different. We put him in this situation where he's with his relatives that are abusive. They withhold his food. It's a very terrible environment. He lives in a closet under the stairs. Within seconds, we recognize we want Harry Potter the hell out of that situation. And he's an extremely compelling, sympathetic character because we've taken all those things that we just talked about and made them worse. So you can certainly kick the dog if you will. Now, what's interesting is kicking the dog also kind of comes into play when we talk about the antagonist from the opposite side of things. I'll tell you more about that in a second. So again, you have the orphan, you have the chosen one, and you have kicking the dog. There are three easy ways to understand a protagonist from the very, very start of your story. Okay. This is one of my favorites, Save the Cat. Okay, so saving the cat, if you think about, I'll give you another example besides the one I'm going to tell you. In the movie The Incredibles, right, we have all these kind of old newsreel footages of the heroes, and one of the things that happens is Mr. Incredible is on his way to his wedding, and a woman loses her cat, the cat's in the tree, and he grabs the tree and he slams the tree down in front of the bad guys and rescues the cat. He literally saves the cat. So we show a protagonist being a good guy because he's nice to animals, in particular cats. Or you show them up in a different way. So this still is from the movie Sea of Love with Al Pacino and Ellen Barkin. It's from the 80s. And in this particular case, we understood the scene comes up on what is a pancake breakfast for the New York Yankees. And you see all these guys in this gym, and the people are getting their pancakes through the line, and folks are walking around. Everybody's very excited about this. And a couple of the guys, kind of the camera focuses on them talking, and Al Pacino walks by and they ask him if he's Phil Rizzuto, who is one of the Yankees announcers and a ball player as well. And they have this banter back and forth, and everybody's so excited. You know, the Yankees are coming for this breakfast, and then Pacino gets on stage and says, "Hey, sorry to tell you guys, something's come up. The Yankees are all they're not going to be able to be here. But the good news is because," and he pulls out his badge, he's a police officer, says, "because you're all wanted felons, you're under arrest." And so they arrest everybody in the gym. They take them out. They load them onto buses. And as the buses pull away, you see Pacino talking with a couple of his buddies. And then down the street from behind the camera comes running a guy with his little boy. He's running to be at the Yankees breakfast. And because we've seen what just happened, we recognize he's a wanted felon, but he's bringing his little boy. Oh no, what's going to happen here? And they get there, and the guy's like, "Hey, what's going on?" "Hey, the Yankees had to leave. Sorry, the breakfast is over." And there's a little talk in the car about what the guy's record is, and Pacino kind of looks at him and tells him again, "Hey, we're sorry, the Yankees had to leave." But at the same time, he kind of lifts up his jacket just a little bit, and he shows him that badge. The guy's eyes get really wide. And so he takes his little boy, and they walk off in the other direction. And we think, wow, okay, this guy, he's a police officer, so they obviously want to clear the streets, but he's got a heart. That was a really cool move that he did. And then Pacino amps it up a little bit later because as the guy's walking away, he goes, "We'll catch you later." And the guy walks away, and we start the rest of the movie. So we understand who this character is, and we want to root for him, and which is particularly important because Sea of Love is a psychological thriller. And it goes all kinds of places over the course of the movie. But because we're endeared to the character from the beginning, we're rooting for him right out the bat because we understand he has a heart. He's a good guy. So that's what we mean by saving the cat. All right. The antagonist, okay, being mean to old people, dogs, and children. Okay. So like I talked about with Kicking the Dog earlier, Stephen King's second novel, The Dead Zone, we meet the antagonist. He's a door-to-door salesman, and he literally kicks a dog to death. We have no doubt he's the bad guy. Think about the latest trilogy of Star Wars movies. When we first see Kylo Ren he kills the character played by Max von Sydow. He's an old guy. So we understand he's the bad guy because he's mean to an old person. Now, the reason why I have Tin Cup up here is a sports movie is because there's a great line, and it's probably a lazy screenwriting joke, but one of Kevin Costner, he plays the protagonist, his name is Roy McAvoy. One of Roy's friends makes a comment about David Sims, played by Don Johnson on the left. He's a snake. He's mean to old people, kids, and dogs. It's done in dialogue. And then we get a little bit later on in the movie where we're starting to think that Don Johnson's not that bad of a guy, but we see him after the first round of the U.S. Open. He's in the lead, and he comes out of the interview and comes down the stairs. He's met by his agent, and they're making comments about what's going to happen when he wins. It's only day one of the tournament, but he's making all these comments about what he wins. And just off the side are an older couple with their grandson, and they're carrying a dog. And he's mean to all three of them at once. And it's done in the view of the stakes characters played by Rene Russo, who basically crystallizes it in her mind that, oh God, he's not a good guy. He's the bad guy. So being tricked to an old person, being mean to an old person, to animals, or to children certainly works to establish your bad guy as a bad guy very, very quickly. All right. Talked about kicking a dog. Yep. So we want to see the character do something horrible. Think about characters, what you do when no one is watching. So we are the audience, and the antagonist doesn't know that we're watching. So when we see what's happening to them or what they do, that has a profound effect on us. So if we set up the protagonist as the person we want to root for, we really want to make sure that the antagonist is not somebody we want to root for. We want to make sure that line is pretty well cut and dried. Now, can you have an antagonist who you kind of want to pull for sometimes? Absolutely, you can. It's very tricky, but you can do so. The idea being here, just for what we're talking about, is try to keep them separate and try to make sure, again, the time you're spending with your protagonist in development, do the same thing with your antagonist. Make them match up against each other. Okay, any questions on tricks or tropes of the trade? Yeah, like I promised, I ruin you for movies. If you ever take one of my story structure classes, I will definitely ruin you for the structure of a movie, because most movies come down to certain time hacks, and it's pretty enlightening. Okay.
Looks like we have a question in the chat. Wendy, are you able to unmute to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. I write in the mystery genre, and I'm wondering about applying these antagonist tricks and tropes when I'm trying to keep that antagonist, the ultimate antagonist, a secret as one of the suspects. So how would I do that? So
while I don't write mysteries, I know that these principles are essentially, they're genre agnostic. It does not matter. So what you can do with a lot of the things with the antagonist is, maybe you have a police report, or maybe you have an eyewitness account, or something that's happened that identifies, the antagonist was mean to old people, kids, or dogs, or whatever else. Or, we put them in a place where we understand what's horrible about them as the antagonist through what the other characters are observing, right? What do we see at the crime scene? Is it just a simple homicide, or is there much more to it? How do I see what's happening with that antagonist? So without identifying who the killer is, you can still show how bad they are and continually ramp up those stakes. So it may not start off so bad, but they're getting worse and worse, so the audience feels that pressure, that the protagonist feels that we have got to put an end to this. We have to identify who the killer is. We have to stop this now before it gets any worse. So you can certainly amp that tension up by delivering more about what they're doing, or also the reactions of the people as they're starting to see these things. They start to realize this is a whole lot more than we thought we were dealing with. So there are ways to do it. Just trust what you're doing with your characters and keep them in the background as much as you can, but reveal more about what they're thinking and doing.
I love that. Thank you. That's a great answer. It keeps it anonymous, but still shows what an awful person. Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, no worries. Anybody else have a question? I thought I saw another one.
Don't see anything else in the chat. Does anyone have a question? Just go ahead and unmute and ask.
Okay. we'll press forward. Okay, so we've talked a lot about character growth, right? And how the protagonist must change going forward. One of the easiest ways to do this is get an idea of how far they have to go. So most of us have an idea when we're writing a project of what we want the end to be, right? Whether we want to find out who the killer is or we want to have the hero of the Rebel Alliance, we have an idea of where we want the hero to be at the end. What you do with character growth is you start them as far away as possible from that point. So again, Luke Skywalker is the hero of the Rebel Alliance at the end, but at the beginning, he's a whiny farm boy who wants to go to the Imperial Flight Academy because he's clueless about what's going on in the universe. So I've put him literally as far away as possible from his goal. Talking about Sleeper Protocol, I have a character who is one of the worst tropes, according to science fiction fans, that you can do, which is the amnesiac protagonist, right? He wakes up without an idea of who he is, but he has to grow and change because he has to fulfill this promise that a whole lot of people have with him that he doesn't necessarily even know about. So he has to grow from essentially zero to what he needs to be. So you start them as far away as possible, and then you show that growth over the course of the journey. Because they're not changing the world. The world is changing them, all right? Up to a certain point, they are not changing the world. The world is changing them. You think about iconic characters like Forrest Gump, for example. Forrest Gump is at all these cool moments in history, and he sees all these different things, but you see that Forrest Gump, over the course of particularly the book by Winston Kroon, just develops, and he becomes a little bit more every time he goes through some of these different things. So we want to see that journey. We want to see the characters proceed. We want to see them grow, and more than anything, we want to see them change, because as we go through life, all of us have changed. We are not the kids that we were when we were 9 or 10 years old. We're probably not the kids we were in college. We're probably not who we were in our 30s or whatever else. And going forward, we're not going to be who we were today. So we're going to be changing. We're going to be moving forward. We're going to be learning. And as we can see that with others, as particularly in books and movies, we love that stuff. Okay. How's everybody doing?
Doing great. Absolutely.
Okay.
Do you have any questions in the room?
I know there's a lot here. I'm glad you guys are recording this. And if you're interested, I do have a recording of this class on YouTube. It was done at the 20 Books to 50K conference a couple years ago. Just search my name and emotional resonance, and it'll come up to you. The video they have for it's kind of crappy, but you get all the audio in the same slides.
We also, on our YouTube channel, post all of our meetings. So this will end up on the Diamond Valley Writers Guild YouTube as well.
Okay, great. Okay, let's talk archetypes and archetypal story structure. All right, so what is an archetype? An archetype is a very typical example of a certain place or thing, right? There's a great book, it's also in my references, called The Hero Within by Dr. Carol Pearson, which defines archetypes so that we all go through in life. And there's 6 of them that we can actually use to portray what happens in a typical fiction plot. So we have the orphan. Hey, wait, we just talked about that, didn't we? Yeah. We have an orphan. We have a wanderer, we have a warrior, we have an innocent, we talked about that with Luke Skywalker, we have a martyr, and we have a magician. So we have all these different aspects that all of us fulfill. So for example, in the room, because I can see you guys on camera, is anybody, I think there was one person who was at their first meeting, is that right?
We actually have 2 people here that have never attended.
Okay, so guess what? You're the orphans of the group. You've come in with no idea what's going on. And by the time you leave today, you'll be wanderers, because that's how this transition works. So we can actually start out with an orphan and move forward. So if we lay out an archetypal story structure, it kind of looks like this. So the colored blocks are typical 3-act story structure. Thank you to Aristotle. But we have Act 1, we have Act 2, Act 3. Act 1 being the setup, Act 2 being confrontation, Act 3 being resolution. But if you'll notice, I have Act 1 as the orphan, then I have the wanderer and the warrior in Act 2, and the martyr in Act 3. Make sense? Think about it. Let me go back to Luke Skywalker. So Luke, we've talked about him being an orphan. We've talked about him essentially being innocent, which when we add in innocent and magician here, you'll see where this makes additional sense. But once Luke goes back to Obi-Wan and says, okay, I want to go with you, that's the transition from Act 1 to Act 2. At that point, Luke is wandering. He becomes a wanderer. He is learning his skills. He's learning and meeting new people. He's just trying to get an idea of where things are in the galaxy because everything he thought he knew is wrong. So he's wandering. At a certain point in Act 2, Luke makes a transition from wanderer to warrior. Now, this does not mean that he starts to win, okay, or become the hero of the Rebel Alliance, but it means that he's learned enough at some point where he says, I can help take action here. This actually happens in Star Wars when they are trapped on board the Death Star. They get to the little security shack, and Luke finds that Leia is in the detention center, and he recruits Han and Chewie, like I talked about earlier. But it's Luke's idea to walk over with the handcuffs and put them on Chewbacca to make him a pretend prisoner that they're going to take to the detention block. It's not Han Solo, who we would think it would be. It's Luke's idea. So that is Luke's transition where he believes he's learned enough to start making a difference, which we all know goes very poorly because they get to the detention block and immediately are trapped and all kind of hell breaks loose. So once you make that transition into warrior, that doesn't mean you're succeeding by any means. It just means that they're taking action versus reacting to the world around them. Now, the martyr phase is pretty simple. They realize at some point that they may have to give their life to change the stakes. So Luke Skywalker, you could say at the end of Act 2, he's accomplished at least part of his goals. He's rescued Princess Leia. He's starting to learn about the Force a little bit, but he hasn't destroyed the Death Star yet. So to destroy the Death Star and essentially really to still save Princess Leia, he might have to give his life to do so. So that's when he straps on that X-Wing fighter and flies off into battle because he's made this recognition that he has to change as well. Otherwise, he has to potentially give his life to make the change that's necessary. So let's add in the innocent. It's kind of weird. I thought I had the innocent wanderer built in, the innocent and the magician. So if you think about it like this, I'll just kind of talk you through this. The innocent phase starts at the orphan and ends in the middle of Act 2. So they understand at the very beginning, we see them as innocent, not understanding the world around them, being essentially kind of clueless as to what's happening. But then as they learn during the wanderer phase, when they make that transition in Act 2 from wanderer to warrior, they've essentially lost their innocence. And then you have them becoming a magician. In Luke's case, it's kind of literal because he's learning the Force, but Luke doesn't really start learning about the Force at the midpoint of Act 2. He really starts learning about it in the front part of Act 2 when they're on the Millennium Falcon and he's training against that little ball that's trying to shoot him in the butt, right? He's using the lightsaber. So Luke has got this understanding about the Force. And as we go into Act 2, especially near the end of Act 2 when Obi-Wan is killed by Darth Vader, the first thing that happens is Luke is standing there, he's wide-eyed, like, what just happened? My mentor just died, and there's this voice in his head, like, run, Luke, run. And Luke's like, what the hell's going on? Luke is understanding that there are different things that are out there. And he is not a Jedi Knight by the end of the story. Okay, that's not the way it works. But he has learned enough about the Force. He is able to use it and trust his feelings and shoot the torpedoes into the Death Star's exhaust port and blow up the Death Star. So he's learned the amount of magician that you have to do to get through the story. Okay, so keys to emotions. So we want to develop our characters. Okay, we want to put our characters, if we can, through the archetype process because we can show that growth over the course of the story because we want to affect what happens with our readers. Okay, if you can do this with your characters, you reach a point where your audience is invested in not just your protagonist and your antagonist, but if you develop your secondary characters enough, you can actually reach a point like I did with my dad not talking to me for a week. So I was writing one of the Four Horsemen Universe novels. It's Fields of Fire. And in the course of Fields of Fire, there's a subplot with two peacemakers. Think like the marshals, if you will, of this future universe. And it's a typical kind of buddy cop kind of story where you have a mentor and you have a young recruit, if you will, young officer. So the mentor is an alien character, and her race in the overall universe is reviled. They've been terrible. They've done terrible things. They're war criminals. That nobody really trusts them. But because the Marshal Service draws from all the different species in the galaxy, they have this particular race as part of the Peacemaker Guild. And this Peacemaker, she has honor. She's really good, and she's mentoring a young human. And I had developed this storyline where I was going to have this process to show that she was good, but then I was going to have the young human be the one that was killed. And I had believed that I was going to set this up as a very emotional moment to show how important it is for humans to become peacemakers. And so it's literally about 10 o'clock at night, and I'm sitting on the couch. I've got my laptop and I'm writing after my wife and kids have gone to bed. And I get ready. I'm getting to that point in the scene where I'm going to make this happen. And I stopped. It was like this thunderclap in my head. It's like, wait a minute. This isn't going to work. All the things that I'd put into the storyline, all the things that I was thinking about as far as their goals and their development, there was that moment of hesitation in my head where it was like, this is not going to work. You need to kill off this senior Peacemaker. And I remember kind of sitting there like, I don't know about this. I've done all this work to make her this good character. I don't know that this is going to work. But I decided to do something that I encourage all of you to do, which is trust yourself. So I wrote that scene. And I write that 2,000, 3,000 word scene. I'm sitting there, I'm just bawling as I write this scene because it's one of the hardest things I'd ever done at that point. And so I write this scene and I finish and I'm wiping my eyes and I close the laptop and I go to bed and I'm laying there doing what all good writers do. We all second guess ourselves, right? So I'm second guessing myself that was the biggest piece of crap I've ever written. I got to change it. I'm gonna get up tomorrow. It's a weekend morning. I'm gonna get up early. I'm gonna go to Starbucks and I'm gonna change it. So I get up the next morning, sneak out of the house, I go to Starbucks, and I sit at one of those high top tables right by the baristas, and I open up the laptop, fully intending that I'm going to re-edit the scene. And I make the mistake of reading it. And I'm reading it, and I'm bawling at the counter at Starbucks. And they're like, are you okay? Like, I'm a writer, I'm fine. And so I finished that, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to leave this in. I'm going to leave it. So I finished the book, I sent it off to my editor. My editor's like, oh, you're in trouble. I'm like, probably. And so book goes through the production process. My dad at that point was 81 years old, and he reads everything that I send him. And so I sent him the book, and the book comes out, it's officially released, and he reads it, and I get this text message, and it's the character's name and a question mark. I won't spoil it for you, but it's the character's name and a question mark. And I wrote him back. It was like, yeah, I had to. It was just, I needed to tell this. I wanted to do something that was emotional and powerful, and it ended up working out very well. Dad doesn't respond. And so a little bit of time passes. I call him. I'm like, hey, what's going on? And he says, I'm not speaking to you. And he hung up the phone. And so I'm literally like, what did I do? 4 days later, he calls me and says, I think I'm over this. So you can do an emotional connection with any character you want. It's best if you do them all. And if you keep in mind their growth, how they change, how they're working with the interactions of your protagonist, or if they're the protagonist, how they're affecting the lives of those around them, you're golden. That's really what emotional resonance comes down to, is you introduce those conflicts, you introduce those relationships, and you think about relationships that you have with your friends or your family, good and bad. The more you can portray of those and those real connections, you make your readers connect to those characters. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the protagonist. You can have fans that are very connected to secondary characters who just love seeing them come back over and over and over again. I've been in a session with Jim Butcher where he talks about his Harry Dresden novels, and there are fans who just love some of the secondary characters. Yeah, they like Harry and they like the storyline, but they love these characters and they love this thing. So there's a lot of different ways to do so. Your idea is just to make it as real as possible and show growth and change over time. Okay, that's the end of my prepared class. And then so we can take any questions, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the resources or my references so you can write those down. Again, highly recommend My Story Can Beat Up Your Story by Jeffrey Allen Schechter. That's the one that really crystallized a lot of things in my head and really affected how I write my books from now on. I do recommend Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. The Hero Within by Carol Pearson is on my bookshelf behind me. It's a fantastic book. And when you're looking at, again, that emotional investment of your audience, it's great to understand the different archetypes that we pass through in our lives and how we can use those to our advantage in talking with readers. And again, and if you have not read On Writing by Stephen King, highly recommend it as well. So, what kind of questions do you all have at this point?
Can you take down the screen share? That way we can see you and see everybody else.
Sure. I was going to leave the references up for just a second to make sure everybody got them.
Okay.
But then, yeah,
everybody make note of the references.
I'm happy to show you my ugly mug. All right, everybody good? We're going to go ahead and pull the references down.
It'll also be on the video on YouTube when it comes out. So you can
Here we go. And stop share. There it goes.
Yay,
Okay.
There you are. Perfect. That way we can see everybody better. Okay, anyone in the room have any questions, comments, reactions to what Kevin said? Please, John, come to the mic, and then Liam.
Hi, and hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Great.
Yeah. Hi, Kevin. Thank you for your service, by the way.
Thank you, too. I appreciate it.
Okay, two observations. I'm believe it or not, a nonfiction guy. It's like, what am I doing here? Great presentation. However, I've started a children's book series, Claire the Magical Dog, and that's fiction. So a lot of what you write is in a condensed version of what I'm doing with the kids' books. So I see the parallels. It's pretty amazing. And you know, I know a lot of you are experienced writers, and you probably already do this. But what I do for all my work, I create character descriptions and biographies. And in this book series, Combat Journal, I took it a step further, and I opened the book with, I call it my cast of characters. And that's like my lead antagonist. I have an entire page of his like background, his personality. And so I have several pages of this for the characters. And it was a technique. I was on the fence whether I should do this or not. And I think as a writer, you should do it always for your characters. So you're not, their personality, their do's, don'ts, likes, dislikes, and how they interact with the others. But I put it in here. I laced it with a lot of comedy, a lot of humor, because the characters, it was like something out of Hogan's Heroes. We have a Colonel Klink, we have a Colonel Hogan. It's amazing parallel. But anyway, that's what I did. I actually put the character descriptions in the book, and it really works. So anyway, that's my comment, observation.
And I would encourage you actually to take that, your dramatis personae, if you will, and I would actually encourage you to move that after the end of the book so that you can reflect, your reader could potentially reflect back on it, because your challenge as a writer is to show me all of that. Don't tell me all of it up front, but show me how you can make those things happen with your characters and what their character really is.
I literally have versions with it at the end of the book and at the end of the book. And I'm in a veterans writing group written by veterans, and we table a lot of these kind of issues. And I was on the fence because I know, those first 10 to 20 pages, you got to sell that book to the reader and get them hooked. And the consensus, the group for this project was keep it in the front because it's humorous. And it really sets up the characters so that when you see Colonel Klink out there, you already know a little bit about, this guy, he's an a-hole. Oh my goodness. Yeah. This guy, he cares about his soldiers. He's a good guy. It set it up, and the story, it's based on a real deployment. So it's nonfiction.
Right.
But I just did it as a technique, but I did take that in consideration, put them in the back of the book. Yeah.
Another technique I've seen like that is it's an anthology. I don't even know if you can buy this anymore. The anthology was called 365 Days. It was an anthology of short stories about the Vietnam War, and the foreword is exceptionally powerful. And it's designed to kind of frame what happens in the stories, and it's a very stark understanding. It's basically almost like a warning label to the author, or to the reader. So you can certainly do that. I would encourage you, though, to lean more towards the idea that you need to sell me that character before you tell me about him.
Great. That's great comments. Liam, you had something?
I did. I didn't necessarily have a question, but I wanted to say my current work in progress is a military science fiction in a kind of a dark, far future. And this presentation has really helped me, just while listening to you, flesh out the antagonist I had that I was struggling with. I was struggling with Act 2. I was struggling with the antagonist. And you've given me a lot of ideas, so I was really grateful for that, and I just want to say thank you.
No worries. Liam, one of the funniest reactions I ever had, I was teaching a class similar to this where I was going through more on the story structure side, and I'm teaching, and it's a large library room, kind of like what you guys are in, and at the very back of the room, about halfway through the presentation, I hear this woman go, "Ah!" And I look back, and her hands are on her head, and I'm like, "Are you okay?" She was like, "You just solved 5 years of work for me." I can't believe it. You've solved 5 years of work. And it was fun because she went to the Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers Colorado Gold event 2 years later and won the award for the best novel for that book. So it was pretty cool. So yeah, there's a lot to it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, any more comments or questions for Kevin? Anyone in the room? Anyone on Zoom have, here comes Greg.
By the way, my name's Greg. I did visit your website, and I noticed that you didn't put your own book on that very important list of books to read to help you write books. And I was wondering if you're ashamed of your own work because you had it priced so damn cheap. But anyhow, I read through the little snippet that you allowed us to read, and it seemed like you might know something about what you're talking about.
Well, you kind of stole my thunder because I've got the copy right here. I was going to show it to you all, and have you guys? Oh, there it is. I wrote what's called the Mercenary Guide to Story Structure. From one of the story structure classes I've taught for years. I had a publisher come up and say, "You need to write a book about this." So I did. So yes, I'm not ashamed of it at all. But since we were talking more about emotions and characters, I wasn't going to throw it at you yet. But thank you for you giving me the recommendation.
Now the other thing that I had a question about, I've noticed there seems to be a trend with some of the rich and powerful writers of our era where they're having other people help write the books with them. And I noticed you had a couple of books that you had a co-author that was involved in the process, and I wonder how that complicates the whole arrangement of, protagonist, antagonist, storyline, and all that stuff.
Sure.
Is it a help or a hindrance having another cook in the kitchen?
So I've actually been very fortunate in this regard because when you work with other writers, one of the first things you have to sit down is basically say, who is the senior writer here? Who's in charge? And in most of the cases where it's my name with somebody else on a book, I've been the one in charge. I've written some short stories with Kevin J. Anderson. Kevin is clearly the senior writer in those particular instances. So once you kind of identify who's in charge, then it's easy to kind of build the story and identify who's going to be doing what. And when everybody understands at the very beginning what you're trying to do with the storyline and your characters, it kind of sets boundaries, kind of like your left and right limits. You have an idea of where you can go and what you can do. You're still going to have disagreements. Okay, that's going to happen. But they're not going to be fist fights or anything along those lines because it's going to be, I really thought about doing this. What about doing this? And in some cases, I will tell you from experience, as a senior writer, I've said, you know what? You've got a better idea than I do. Let's do it that way. And in some cases, as a junior writer, I did that to Kevin J. Anderson too, which was kind of fun. And we hemmed and hawed about it for about a week. And Kevin's wife was like, Ike is right. So there's an easy way to do so. It's communications, and it's establishing who's doing what. And if you understand everything that's going on with the story and where you're intending to go, and you're working at it together, it's an easy thing to do. You have to have that communication in place.
Okay, dovetailing on that question, I have a question. So when you're in the process, when you're co-writing a work like that, do you alternate chapters? Does one person do a first draft, second draft goes through the second person? What is your process on that?
Typically with the books that I've written with somebody else, we have an idea of the storyline that we're going to write. But it comes back to that, again, communication-wise, I will say something like, I'm going to write a chapter. But if I'm using characters or if I'm touching the storyline of what's happening in any way, my co-author has full veto authority, and I want them to read and go in and edit. Because if we can make our voices mesh, if you will, I can make it to the point where the reader does not fully understand who's writing the story. So I wrote with my friend Kevin Steverson on a couple of the Four Horsemen books, and they are basically buddy cop movies. And we got to the point there's a lot of humor, which is one of Kevin's hallmarks, and it was always fun for us, especially when the first book or two came out. We'd be at a convention or a gathering, and people would be like, "Oh man," they tell Kevin Steverson, "I could totally tell, when you had this character tell that character that joke, it was great." And Kevin would look at him and go, "He did it." And if you can actually make that happen, it's easy to do. It's just you write your work and then have that other person go through and make those edits and make those suggestions. And if everything's working well and you're working towards the same goal, it's fairly easy to do.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Any more questions or comments on Zoom? Unmute if you have something you want to say to Kevin. Everybody's so quiet today. No? No more questions or comments? All right. Well, then I just want to say that this has been a fabulous presentation, Kevin. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to our group. I know you and I have been trying to get this together for, I think, about a year, back and forth,
Yeah.
Schedule conflicts and different things you've had going on. And I don't know about you, all in the room or on Zoom, but I'd love to have you come back and talk about your story structure maybe next year. Absolutely great presentation. And just so people know, what is your conference schedule for the rest of this year and going into next year?
So I'm actually done with most of my major conferences for the year. I will be going to an event with Chris Kennedy Publishing. We call it FactoryCon. It's not really a convention. It's just authors and readers that get together, and we go deep sea fishing out in North Carolina and do a bunch of other stuff. It's just kind of fun. For next year, I'll be teaching at the Superstars Writing Seminar here in Colorado Springs in February. It's not officially released yet, but FinCon, which is a small literary convention, science fiction and fantasy in Dallas, Texas, has done a writer's workshop for several decades. And with COVID, it actually went away. They're bringing it back this next year, and I've been tapped as the instructor, so I'll be teaching that in February as well. And then the only other thing that's on my schedule so far for 2025 would be LibertyCon, which is the Tennessee Science Fiction and Literature Convention in Chattanooga, Tennessee next June.
Well, it sounds like you have a full dance card. Oh, we have another question.
Sure.
Hey, I just wanted to ask about that picture behind you.
So the picture behind me is actually the cover. Let's see if I can do this. It's the cover of my novel, The Crossing. No, it's not going to. The camera with the blurred background. Let me see if I can turn that off real quick. You'll see my messy bookshelf, but see if I can disengage.
Every writer has a messy bookshelf. If you don't, you're not a writer.
I love that. Let me see if I can get the background off. I got a better idea. Hang on, let me pull up the image real quick. So when I was talking about the idea of working with a mentor, I had the opportunity at my very first time I went to the Superstars Writing Seminar. It's the Superstars Seminar is a seminar built for the business of writing. So it's not necessarily all about craft and how you write, but it's more about things like contracts, more about things, how to deal with the media, how to work with an editor or an agent. So there's a lot to it. And so I was encouraged to go to the conference years ago by Kevin J. Anderson. And so I went in 2014 for the very first time, and I had the opportunity to have dinner with Eric Flint, who Eric Flint was one of the masters of alternate history. And as a young writer, I had done what probably all of you have done. I had a notebook that I scribbled down a whole lot of ideas in. And I decided, as I was sitting there at dinner, there was an idea that had been in the back of my head for a long time that was, what would it have been like if the coin that George Washington reputedly threw across the Delaware River prior to the Battle of Trenton was a bicentennial quarter? And at dinner, at the end of dinner, I felt good, and I leaned over and I asked Eric. I said, "Eric, I have this idea that I don't know how to write. It's alternate history. I don't know what to do with it." And Eric he had kind of a gruff voice. He came across as a curmudgeon, but he was really a big teddy bear. And he's like, "Well, what's the idea?" And so I told him, and his eyes lit up. And we went to lunch the next day. And over the course of about a year and a half, we traded emails and phone calls and notes. And then he basically said at the end of 2016, early 2017, he said, "You're ready to write this book. Write this book." So I did. And it became my first traditionally published book through Bain Books in August of 2022. So again, it's a story of a group of Army ROTC cadets who are sucked back in time. As soon as they arrive in 1776, they're hit by a Hessian patrol. They take casualties and wounded, but they also lose a modern rifle to the enemy, and that becomes their catalyst to report to George Washington and change the course of American history.
Very good. Any other questions or comments? It is a cool cover. I like the cover.
Well, I will tell you, one of the things you hear about it from different writers, conferences, and whatever else is, you'll never get the opportunity to design your cover. Big publishers won't let you do that. When I got the email about what I thought I wanted to have on the cover, this was the idea. Take Benjamin Lutz's original painting of Washington crossing the Delaware and change it with, Army cadets in there. I had to leave the flag bearer because the flag bearer is actually James Monroe, if you didn't know that. And James Monroe plays a part in the book as well. But I wrote up the information, what I wanted. This was exactly what I wanted. I sent it in. The artist emailed me back about an hour later and basically said, oh, hell yes, we're doing this. So you do have the opportunity at times to actually design your covers. I'm happy to tell you I am 27 for 27. I've designed all my covers.
Oh, my goodness. That's pretty good because I think, isn't all of your books traditionally published at this point? Or
not at this point. I've got mostly small publishers, which you can kind of call traditional, but I've got one that's big 5. So,
well, congratulations on that. That's always good. Any other questions or comments? Okay, then without further ado, I'd like to thank you again, Kevin, for the wonderful presentation. And I'd like Lynette to tell us about next month's meeting.
Hey, everybody. It is our annual poetry and bring your poems. And I would like you to have a little bit of background or reason why, what the inspiration was. And we will be reading them live. If for some reason you can't make it, but you still like to submit a poem, then do that and we will have some readers available. This is one of our really fun times of the year where we get to celebrate each other's creativity. So we're really looking forward to it. It'll be our 9th annual.
Thank you, Lynette. Lynette has been running it for the last few years since our previous person retired from running it. 9th annual. I don't know if you caught that. 9th year in a row that we have had the poetry celebration as one of our annual meetings. And it's a lot of fun. Everyone gets to get to the mic, read their poetry or a favorite poem from another poet. So if you can make it, we'd love to have you. A couple of quick reminders. Don't forget, we're still looking for volunteers one Saturday a month. And membership. If you're not a paid member, we'd love to have you. This is how we keep doing what we do. It's not cheap to keep a nonprofit organization running, but we would love your support. If you have any questions on that, email the Guild, dvwg, or dvwritersguild@gmail.com, or go to the website and you can actually click on join. It's real easy to do. And without further ado, our next meeting again is on August 17th in here in this room and live on Zoom. And we're adjourning for lunch, Emilio's. I'm sorry, those of you in Montana and Colorado and every place you're at can't make it in time. I don't think there's any flights that are direct. So we'll see you all next month. Thank you.